He's the cute little kid whose sweet, innocent smile may have been hiding a lot of pain and suffering.
The worst part was I remembered the boys screaming.
As a teenager, Dora Wolf used to babysit 6-year-old Gary Ray Hose, the Phoenix boy who went missing in 1974. Wolf tells us Gary's mother would instruct her to leave Gary and his twin brother Jerry, who were 3 at the time, locked in their room for hours with nothing to eat or drink.
I wasn't allowed to let them out. I wasn't even allowed to go in the room. But you can't just sit there and hear a child crying because he's hungry. I couldn't do it. So I basically broke into the bedroom and I fed him and gave him water. There were bruises on them. And it was sad. I mean, it really was. I can't even dream of ever treating a child that way. I'd go home from babysitting for them and I would cry because I didn't like what I was seeing. That wasn't something that anybody should witness. I wish that we would have done something about it because those babies were being so abused and neglected. It was awful.
April 30th, 1974. Just after sunset, a terrified 6-year-old boy runs barefoot through the streets of Phoenix, Arizona. He's not playing. He's not lost. He's running for his life. Gary Ray Hose is bleeding. His shirt is torn. And he's running from a home where no child should ever be sent back to. A neighbor sees him. Calls the police. Officers arrive, find him, alone, terrified. They place him in the back of the squad car, and drive him right back to the front door of the very place he was escaping. What happens next is a blank page in history. Because that night, after being returned home by police, Gary Ray Hose is never seen again. Not by teachers. Not by neighbors. Not even by his own twin brother. And somehow, no one reports him missing. Not for 2 decades. The boy's name is eventually forgotten. No media headlines. No missing poster. No police file. The file doesn't exist, because the case doesn't exist. It's as if he vanished from thin air. Until one of his brothers, grown now, comes forward with a confession. He says Gary didn't disappear. He was killed. Buried. In the middle of a 3-acre stretch of desert just outside Maricopa, Arizona. By their own mother. So here's the question that holds this case hostage. How does a 6-year-old vanish? Get buried in the desert? And no one, not one adult, asks where he went. In this documentary, we dig through the silence. We follow the trail that was never followed. And we ask the one question law enforcement waited too long to answer. What happened after the door closed behind Gary Ray Hose? And why did it take 20 years for anyone to ask? Kindly comment below the city you are watching us from. If you believe stories like this deserve answers, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like. Comment your thoughts. This is Crime and Tragedy Watch. And this is the case of a 6-year-old boy who tried to escape from child abuse and torture, but never got the chance to run again. And the most disturbing part, the property where Gary is believed to be buried still hasn't been fully searched. Gary Ray Hose was born in 1968 in Phoenix, Arizona, alongside his twin brother, Jerry. They were inseparable from the start, same clothes, same crib, same everything. But behind closed doors, the Hose household wasn't like most others. Gary and Jerry weren't raised. They were contained. Their mother, Charlene Hose, and her second husband, Walter, had custody of the children. But what was going on inside that home never reached police, never raised alarms at school. Because the boys, especially Gary, weren't allowed to be seen. Multiple accounts, including those given later by family members and former neighbors, paint the same picture. Gary and Jerry were frequently locked in closets. Not for minutes. Not as punishment. But for entire days. Sometimes with no food. Sometimes in the dark. Sometimes in their own waste. When they were let out, they were reportedly beaten. Belts. Cords. Hands. The sounds of that violence didn't stay hidden. One neighbor, Mary Fields, would later recall hearing children scream through the thin apartment walls, screams that sounded panicked, desperate, and constant. And yet, no one came to check. No welfare visits. No school alerts. No official records of concern. So the abuse went unnoticed, at least on paper. But Jerry remembered. And decades later, he would recall in vivid detail what it meant to be Gary's twin brother in that house. He remembered the closet. The hunger. The bruises that never had time to fade before new ones appeared. He remembered the time their stepfather made Gary stand in a corner, for hours, until he collapsed. And how Charlene would force-feed them soap for speaking out of turn. These aren't embellishments. They're backed by witness statements. By the babysitter, Dora Wolf, who would later tell police she was once told to lock the twins in a room, deny them food, and leave them there while their mother and Walter went out. She didn't. But it told her everything she needed to know. Still, nothing was ever filed. No calls to child protection. No records of abuse. Only memories. Which raises the question. How many times does a child have to cry before someone hears them? But it wasn't just neglect. It was tactical. The children were hidden from the world. According to family testimony, the twins were rarely allowed outside. They didn't attend school regularly. And when they did, Gary would show up bruised, withdrawn, afraid to speak. But again, no action was taken. No one asked why. So they learned to survive. Quietly. Together. Until one day, Gary couldn't take it anymore. He tried to run. Not metaphorically. Not emotionally. But physically, he tried to leave. It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't mischief. It was survival. And that's where everything begins to fall apart. But here's what no one knew at the time. That decision, to run barefoot through a Phoenix street, would be the last known choice Gary ever made. And here's what's never been answered. What did Charlene do, the moment Gary came back? Because hours later, the family would pack their things and vanish from their apartment. And Gary Ray Hose would never be seen again. His name wouldn't appear in missing persons databases. No Amber Alert. No photo on milk cartons. And the only people left with answers were the same ones who had spent years making sure Gary had no voice. So I ask again, how does a child disappear, and the world moves on as if he never existed? What's next of this story? Now, let's dive deep into the story. The day Gary ran is the same day someone in that house may have decided he wasn't coming back. April 30th, 1974. A Tuesday. Phoenix, Arizona. Sometime after 7 p.m., Gary Ray Hose bolts from the apartment. He doesn't grab shoes. He doesn't take a jacket. He doesn't look back. He's 6 years old. And he is running, barefoot, through city streets. What made him snap that day is still unclear. But according to his twin brother Jerry, Gary had been beaten the night before. That morning, he had refused to eat. He was quieter than usual. And by sundown, he was gone. A neighbor, whose name was never officially released, sees a small child wandering alone. He looks injured. There are visible bruises on his arms. He's limping. She calls the police. Now here's where everything could have changed. One moment, just one moment, stood between life and disappearance. Phoenix police respond. They arrive. They see the boy. And they recognize him, because it's not the first time they've had contact with the Hose family. But still, no questions are asked about the bruises. No one contacts Child Protective Services. No photographs. No medical evaluation. They load Gary into the back of the squad car. And they drive him straight back to the front door of his home. No report is filed. No follow-up is scheduled. And Gary, still trembling, is handed back to the same people he was trying to escape. The door opens. Charlene stands there. She takes Gary by the arm. The officer walks away. And that was the last moment anyone outside that home ever saw Gary alive. What happened after the door closed has never been proven. But what's been alleged is difficult to ignore. Because less than 48 hours later, the entire family packed up and moved. Not across town. Out to a remote 3-acre property in rural Maricopa, Arizona, about 30 miles from the city. No forwarding address was left. No goodbye to neighbors. No school withdrawal notice. And no one, not a single person, asked where Gary went. He simply vanished. So how is it possible that a 6-year-old disappears immediately after being returned home by law enforcement? And no one even notices he's gone. Why was there no wellness check? Why didn't the officer follow up? And what exactly did Gary walk into when that door shut behind him? We may never know what was said that night. Or what punishment Charlene had planned. But what we do know is this. His twin brother Jerry says Gary was still alive when he got home. But hours later, he was gone. Jerry didn't see him after that night. Neither did their older brother, Guy. Not at dinner. Not in bed. Not the next morning. Charlene claimed Gary had run away again. That he'd gone to stay with relatives. That he was fine. But there were no calls. No family visits. No return. It was a story no one outside the family could confirm. Because by the time anyone thought to ask, Gary's name wasn't even in the system. Now ask yourself this, if a child dies in a house where no one's watching, how long does it take before someone notices he's not around? For Gary Ray Hose, that answer was 21 years. And when someone finally came forward, it wasn't a detective. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a family friend. It was his twin brother. And what he claimed about what happened after that police car pulled away would reframe the entire case. Because what if Gary didn't vanish? What if he never left the property at all? What if everything we needed to know about that night was buried right behind the house? In the days immediately after Gary Ray Hose vanished, there were no police bulletins. No frantic door-to-door searches. No flyers. No news reports. Instead, the family moved. Overnight. Charlene, Walter, and the remaining children packed what they could into a car and drove 30 miles south, out of Phoenix, into the empty flatlands near Maricopa. Their new home? A single trailer sitting on a 3-acre patch of dust and dirt. No neighbors nearby. No traffic. No questions. Gary's name was never brought up again. At least, not by the people who were supposed to protect him. He didn't go back to school. His medical records stopped. There were no calls to relatives. No police report ever filed. To the outside world, it was as if Gary Ray Hose had never existed. But what was happening inside the family was different. Years later, Guy, Gary's older brother, would reveal what he remembered about that night. He says he saw Gary come home. And saw what Charlene did. He didn't give vague memories. He didn't speak in riddles. He gave a specific, direct accusation. She killed Gary that night. I saw the bruises. I know what I saw. Guy didn't say Gary disappeared. He said Gary died. And if his statement is true, then the timeline becomes chillingly clear. Gary tries to run. Police bring him back. Charlene lashes out. And by nightfall, he's gone. No body. No investigation. Just silence. So why didn't Guy speak up then? That question haunted him, and it still does. He was just a child. Afraid. Living under the same roof as the people he now believed were capable of killing his brother. What could he do? Who would believe him? For everyone else, life moved on. But for Jerry and Guy, the silence was louder than anything they'd heard growing up. They knew Gary hadn't just vanished. They knew. But they said nothing. Because they were still children. Still afraid of Charlene. Still afraid of what might happen if they spoke up. But eventually, one of them would. And when he did, he pointed police to one specific place. A patch of land in the back corner of that 3-acre desert property. A place Charlene never let the kids go near. A place where, even decades later, the dirt didn't settle quite right. The question now wasn't just what happened to Gary. It was, is his body still there, beneath the surface, waiting to be found? And if so, why wasn't it discovered sooner? That question would come back again, 20 years later, when law enforcement finally showed up with a search warrant. But by then, it may have already been too late. Because someone else had gotten there first. If you have watched this far, subscribe to complete our first 1,000 subscribers. Thank you. Now, let's dive even deeper into the story. By the mid-1990s, Jerry was in his late 20s. And for the first time in his life, he found the courage to say what had haunted him since childhood. He walked into a police station in Arizona, and told them everything. He said Gary didn't run away. He said Gary never even made it through the night. He said their mother, Charlene, had beaten him to death. And buried his body. Not far from where they'd lived. But on the family's own property in Maricopa. According to Jerry's statement, the burial happened quickly, hours after the police had returned Gary to the house. There was no ceremony. No effort to hide it from the children. She allegedly did it herself. Jerry's story wasn't vague. He described the exact location. A corner of the land near a line of desert brush. He said she used a shovel from the shed. And that she warned the kids never to go near that part of the yard. "Your brother's gone," she had told them. "If you speak, you'll be next." He remembered those words. Because he says they were repeated often. And he believed her. But why now? Why wait 20 years? According to Jerry, he'd spent years trying to forget. Trying to bury the memory just like his brother had been buried. He didn't think anyone would believe him. He thought too much time had passed. Until one day, he couldn't keep it in any longer. He started having flashbacks. He couldn't sleep. He'd look at his own children and see Gary's face. That's when he made the decision to speak. Police finally opened a case. But there was a problem. There was no missing persons report. No original case file. Nothing to reopen. Investigators located the property in Maricopa, still there. Still standing. Still owned by the family. Charlene was gone. No known address. No forwarding contact. She had seemingly disappeared into thin air. But Walter, the stepfather, was still living in the area. Free. Uncharged. Unaffected. Detectives interviewed both surviving brothers, Jerry and Guy. Their stories aligned. Both claimed Gary had been abused. Both claimed he died that night. Both pointed to the same patch of desert. But even with that information, the search didn't happen right away. Permits were needed. Ownership had to be traced. Resources were limited. By the time law enforcement did get access to the land, it had been decades. Shifting soil. Extreme desert temperatures. Erosion. Time had done what silence couldn't, it erased evidence. But here's where the case takes another disturbing turn. According to public records obtained by the Arizona Republic, cadaver dogs were brought in. And in the exact spot the brothers described, they alerted. Not once. Twice. That should have triggered a full forensic excavation. But for reasons still unclear, it didn't. Authorities dug. But only a shallow surface scrape. No body was recovered. No additional search followed. And without remains, the case stalled. Charlene still wasn't located. No charges were filed. And the story once again faded from public view. Jerry told a local outlet in 1995, "I was 6 when I watched my twin disappear. I waited 20 years for someone to ask where he went. And when I finally answered, no one listened. So now, we ask, why wasn't a full search ordered? Why did it take 2 decades for anyone to open a file on Gary Ray Hose? And why was Charlene allowed to vanish, just like her son?" The clock had been ticking since 1974. But when Jerry came forward, it finally rang. The problem? No one was ready to hear it. But the truth was no longer buried. And what happened next, after Jerry's public plea, would force investigators to take a second look. And this time, the entire country would be watching. In 2015, more than 4 decades after 6-year-old Gary Ray Hose vanished, the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office finally acted on what had been whispered for years. They received a new tip. A secret. Buried. Armed with that, detectives filed for search warrants for 2 locations. It had taken 41 years for law enforcement to bring boots, shovels, dogs, and radar. No expense was spared this time. Detectives methodically combed through both properties. They dug in multiple places. They analyzed the soil. They used technology that didn't even exist in the 1970s. The search took days. And then, nothing. No bones. No clothing. No DNA. No trace of Gary Ray Hose. Just desert. The public response was immediate. How could 2 brothers, with matching testimonies, point to the exact same place? And yet no body be found? Were they lying? Were they misremembering? Or had something happened to the grave site long before police ever arrived? That's when another twist surfaced. What detectives didn't know at the time, what no one had told them, was that just weeks before the search, the family had gone back. Not to mourn. Not to visit. But to dig. According to testimony from a family member later interviewed by ABC 15 Arizona, relatives returned to the Maricopa property shortly before the scheduled search. They brought tools. They brought a truck. And they spent hours near the same back corner Jerry had pointed out, the place he said Gary had been buried in 1974. Neighbors saw them. One even told reporters, they looked like they were working fast, and they didn't say why. When questioned by police later, no one could explain what they were doing. No landscaping. No construction. No permit on file. Just digging. Then disappearing again. So the question becomes, was Gary's body there, and moved before law enforcement arrived? If so, by whom? Charlene, the woman accused by her own sons, had died by then. No official obituary exists under her full name. No public death certificate has been verified. But according to family, she passed away in the early 2000s. Walter, the stepfather, was still alive during the 2015 search. He gave minimal statements. He was never charged. He denied knowing anything. But how could an entire human body disappear, twice? Once in 1974. Again in 2015. Even cadaver dogs, used at both locations, had hit on a spot behind the trailer. Their signals were clear. But still, no physical remains were recovered. Experts say after 40 years, it's possible that natural decomposition, combined with harsh desert conditions, could have reduced a child's remains to untraceable fragments. Especially if the body had been buried shallow, then moved, then exposed. But others, former law enforcement included, believe there's more to it. They point to the family's timing. The unexplained activity before the dig. The silence. The missing mother. The conflicting answers. And they ask, what were they trying to erase? This wasn't a case buried in old files. This was a case buried in sand. And when police finally went looking, Someone else had already been there. Someone with a reason. Someone with knowledge. Someone who didn't want Gary to be found. Which leads to another question. If Gary's not on that property now, where is he? And more importantly, who moved him? Because if you believe Jerry, if you believe Guy, if you believe the dogs, the radar, and the decades of silence, then you believe Gary was there. And that someone made sure he's not anymore. Why, after 40 years of silence, would someone return to that land, just before it was about to be searched, unless they had something to hide? And more importantly, what did they take with them? Then came a break no one expected. A woman. Older now. Living out of state. She claimed to have grown up with the family. Knew the children. Visited the house. Saw things, heard things, that didn't make sense back then. But made perfect sense now. She remembered something disturbing. She said Charlene made comments about a hole in the yard. Warned the kids not to go back there. Said, something bad happened there once. And it's over. Don't dig it up. She remembered Jerry and Gary being unusually quiet. Always bruised. One day, Gary was there. The next, gone. And no one talked about it again. When asked why she never said anything, she broke down in tears. I was young. We all were. I thought he ran away. That's what we were told. But I knew it wasn't right. Something felt off. Something always felt off. Her testimony added weight to the brothers' claims. Corroborated details about the backyard. The hole. The warnings. She even remembered seeing Walter carrying a large bag to the back corner of the property the morning after Gary disappeared. A bag he never brought back. Was that the moment everything changed? Did the family bury Gary that day? Then, decades later, dig him up to protect a lie? It's a theory law enforcement never confirmed. But one that more than a few investigators privately admit makes sense. They had waited too long. And by the time they moved, someone else had gotten there first. The beatings. The yelling. That poor child crying through the night. Gary and Jerry were just 6. Twins, barefoot in the dust. Always bruised. Always quiet. Mary said she once offered Charlene a blanket for the boys during a cold night. Charlene snapped, told her to mind her own business. And slammed the door shut. But it wasn't just the noise. It wasn't just the silence that followed. It was what happened that night. April 30th, 1974. Sometime after dark, Mary heard the familiar sound of crying from the Hose trailer. But this time, it stopped suddenly. Then, a knock at her door. Slow. One knock. Then 2. She opened it. Walter Hose, Gary's stepfather, stood outside. No shoes. No shirt. Just standing there. He didn't say a word. His eyes were red. His hands were shaking. She said he opened his mouth like he was about to speak. But nothing came out. Then he turned. And walked back into the dark. Mary never saw Gary again. She assumed he ran away. Just like the story the family eventually passed around. But something didn't sit right. She had lived next to them for nearly 5 years. She knew Gary was afraid of the dark. He never left the yard without Jerry. He never went anywhere without shoes. And now, he was gone. No goodbye. No search party. No police cars. Just silence. Mary said she waited for someone to come knocking. To ask questions. To look into it. No one did. Mary told police in 2015 that she was afraid to speak out at the time. Charlene was unpredictable. Walter was quiet, but not kind. It was fear, she said. We lived in the desert. There were no cameras. No cell phones. Just fear. And I've carried that night with me for 40 years. But why didn't anyone listen when Mary did come forward? Because like the rest of the case, her testimony came too late. The ground had already shifted. The evidence, gone. The child, forgotten. But her account matched everything Jerry said. Same night. Same timeline. Same corner of the yard. And her description of Walter, numb, shaking, unable to speak, raised even more questions. Was he about to confess? Was guilt eating away at him? Or was he just afraid of what his wife had done? And there was one more thing Mary shared. She remembered seeing something behind the trailer the morning after Gary vanished. A patch of ground, freshly covered. No grass. Just loose dirt. A trash can beside it. She didn't think much of it then. But now, she believes that's where Gary was buried. At least, at first. So if Mary's right, if Jerry's right, if the dogs are right, then Gary Ray Hose's body was once there. But now, it's gone. Just like the people who could answer for it. No arrests. No indictments. No resolution. Just silence. And in that silence, one truth remains. A 6-year-old boy disappeared from a home surrounded by people. Neighbors heard him cry. Family saw him beaten. Police dropped him off. And yet, no one stopped what happened next. Charlene Hose died in 2016. Walter, her husband, passed away in 2014. Neither faced charges. Neither answered for Gary. No trial. No verdict. Just silence. Their deaths closed the door on accountability, but not on questions. Imagine a household where fear locks your lips. Abuse becomes normal. Loyalty is forced. Speaking out is unsafe. That's the environment Gary walked into every day. A system built on silence, fear, and trauma. Partnership between mother and stepfather, Charlene the enforcer, Walter the enabler. According to both brothers, Charlene led the most brutal part of the abuse. Jerry described her as the one causing broken bones and internal injuries. Walter, he says, followed her lead, tying the boys down, holding limbs steady, while she struck. Gary wasn't just beaten. He was punished for living. In 1974, at age 6, he reached the breaking point. He ran. He disappeared. He never returned. And that gap, between a terrified escape and a vanished life, reveals the real crime. Just a blank record for a missing child. That's not an oversight. It's a decision to let the system look away. Analyze it like a profiler. This family operated under fear. They kept secrets. They controlled narratives. Charlene's sudden departure from Phoenix after Gary vanished wasn't choice. It was calculated. Get away. Stay hidden. Erase tracks. And Walter? Quiet. Present. Always at Charlene's side. He didn't stop the abuse. He didn't object. He stood by. So what purpose did facing arrest serve? What motive would drive them to answer questions? None, for them. It wasn't justice they wanted. It was preservation. For 41 years, that preservation worked. No public outcry. No legal pursuit. Until the brothers spoke out. And even then, the system didn't pivot fast enough. Again, no body. No remains. No conviction. Just a mother and stepfather who died before being held responsible. What happened to the crime scene? The Maricopa property? The Maricopa property, once the final scene in Gary's life, didn't stay quiet for long. Ownership transferred. Not to a stranger, but to someone from the family. A younger brother named Jeff, who inherited the land after Charlene and Walter passed away. That transfer? It happened in the early 2000s, formally recorded in county deeds. But here's the twist. Jeff has granted no permissions to any dig on the property. No permits. No investigations. The land remains locked. So we ask, why would someone refuse to investigate a piece of land tied to a missing child? He's not a suspect, but he controls access. And under his ownership, the secrets remain buried. That decision, intentional or not, places the power of discovery in his hands. And with it, the responsibility. There are no cameras. No fences. No restrictions unless contested. The land keeps its secrets. And the silence is deafening. There's a swing set in the yard, achingly empty. Weathered chains sway in the desert breeze. A relic of a childhood lost. Every crack in the soil, every crease in the wind, carries a memory that refuses to be erased. Now a question stands before us. If Gary's remains are still on that land, who will speak up to have them exhumed? Will relatives push? Will authorities persist? Or will the land's silent legacy continue? Because those who live farthest away from answers usually stay the quietest. So here's what matters now. Will truth find a champion? Will justice finally reach the place where it was denied so many years ago? Or will Gary's final resting place remain unmarked? Unseen? Unknown? This is more than a case file. It's a challenge. Packed in deeds and desert dust. Held by someone who, by choice, has kept the lock in place. Will that lock ever open? Or will the wind stay as the only witness left? What happened to Gary? We may never know the full truth. But we understand the mechanism. A household designed to suppress. Where Gary was the first casualty. And for us, watching now, there's one final question that matters. Can a family built on silence ever offer justice? Or is that silence its own sentence? We've followed the trail. We've asked the questions. The next move is up to someone with the power to dig. If today's episode moved you, subscribe now for more explorations into lives hidden in plain sight. Quick recap of the case. Gary Ray Hose was 6 years old. No more than 50 pounds. No shoes. No protection. Just a desperate will to survive. He ran barefoot through an Arizona night, hoping someone, anyone, would see him. And someone did. A neighbor called police. An officer picked him up. They returned him to the front door of the very place he was trying to escape. That was the last time Gary was seen alive by anyone outside that house. No grave. No headstone. No obituary. Just a line in a report, decades too late, stating, presumed deceased. But we don't need an official ruling to see the truth. Gary didn't vanish. He was erased. And the silence that followed, it wasn't accidental. It was taught. It was enforced. It was inherited. Charlene Hose went to her grave with no charges. Walter too. And the land they lived on. Still quiet. Still holding secrets. So what happens when no one speaks for the lost? What happens when the story of a murdered child doesn't make headlines? Until 40 years later. You get this. An open field in Maricopa. A swing creaking in the wind. And a name you've only just heard, Gary Ray Hose. He had a twin brother. He had hope. He had dreams of running far from that home. But the world never made space for his voice. If justice is measured by what we do after we know the truth, then this story isn't over. Because now you know his name. Gary wasn't just forgotten. He was failed. By his parents. By his neighbors. By a system that never asked the right questions. But you can ask now. And maybe, finally, someone will answer. Comment below, what do you think happened to Gary? Share to keep his name and his story alive. To remind others that silence shouldn't have the final say. Thank you for staying until the end. Stay safe.